Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Firefighters Podcast, where we seek to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operator through a series of wide-ranging conversations. Now, before we go any further, just hit that rate, follow, or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator for us and helps us reach even more people. Now, here's what we've got for you today.
Catherine, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thank you. I'm good.
I was really excited about our conversation today because it's kind of like a weird role reversal. I've seen so many things you've written. I've met you for the first time, I think, at the Emergency Services show, and was just bowled over by insights, and also felt half like a fraud and the other half just way out of my depth when I was listening to some of the stuff that we were talking about. We kind of had a one-to-one between some of the seminars that you were doing and the wealth of knowledge and experience and people that you interact with on a daily basis is a real gut check for me to want to get better at what we're trying to do here. But for people that are unfamiliar, you are editor of the Emergency Services Times. So just to zoom out a little bit there, the Emergency Services Times is the UK's leading publication dedicated to the emergency services sector. It's now in its third decade. Wow, didn't realise that. EST provides an in-depth analysis, insights and news tailored for all blue light emergency services and their partner agencies. A significant publication readership, supplemented. You've got a 24-hour news website and newsletter. I didn't realise that. 24-hour news website. Crikey. That's got to be crazy. Give us an insight into how you found yourself into this role and kind of give us the elevator pitch, piecing together some of your career aspects, taking you to where you are now.
Okay, so I've been editor of Emergency Services Times since April last year, 2022. I came into the role having spent about 10 years freelancing, where I was writing about fire. Prior to that, I spent some time in America doing some writing and visiting American fire services. Before that, I was deputy head of community safety at London Fire Brigade. And then before that, I spent 10 years in civil service, mostly specialising in fire. So there's a real fire theme through my career. So in terms of Emergency Services Times, we publish 6 times a year in print until the end of this year. And then we are going pure digital from 2024, which is very exciting.
Why the shift to that? Because that probably is a great place for us to start in like understanding the methods of Did you ever read a book by Neil Postman, Amusing Ourselves to Death?
No, what's that?
Oh, I'll send you a link to it. Amusing Ourselves to Death is a really, really interesting book. And it effectively, public disclosure in the age of show business book. He's an educator himself. And it kind of talks about what happens when politics, journalism and education all kind of mix into each other. And it alludes to when news shows started to be like shows and they started to put music to them and stuff like that. So I suppose that's a strange overarching thing to kick this part of the conversation off with, but that aspect of, written form into news, into radio, into now seeing the emergence of things like online articles, online magazines and podcasts and so many other things. What's been the shift and decision, and I know it's not solely been your decision, but going totally digital for 2024?
That's an interesting question. I think we have to accept the fact that people consume media in different ways today. So when I first started my career, you would get, in fact, when I joined the civil service in 2000, this is a good example. So I joined the civil service in 2000. I sat in the communications department. I worked on the website for Department for the Environment, Transport and the Regions. That was my first job in the civil service. And every day, a copy of the Evening Standard would appear on my desk, but not just one, 4 editions. So the newspaper, they would deliver the first edition, the third edition, the fourth edition, and the West End Final every day onto my desk and on the desk of everybody in the press office. So I think we've gone from that to now the thinnest copy of the Evening Standard delivered sitting outside boxes in train stations in London. This is obviously a very London-centric example. And their media, most of their presence is digital now. So over that 23-year period, you can see the change in how we consume our media. So we were literally getting clippings every day in a big file like this of all the newsprint. Nothing digital, nothing web-based. It was all digital. And today, people are on their phones, as we all are, sitting there with them on the train. Nobody's reading a newspaper anymore, except for me. I'm still reading the Guardian and newspapers. I think it's an example of demonstrating how consumer habits have changed and how we consume media. And I think for all media outlets, whatever they are, trade or national or anything really, is to consider you have to be where your readers are. And if your readers are digital, then you need to be in that space. You need to be on their phone. You need to be on their iPad. You need to be in their ears when they're listening in the car, on the tube, because people are always sitting with headphones and they're all listening to podcasts and webinars and all these different things. So I think it makes sense to kind of think, well, actually, if people aren't in our space now, or if there's less of them, then really we should probably move our resources to where the interest is. And so that's a very hard decision for Motor Services Times, and in particular for David Holden and David Brown, who are the owners of Broden Media, who published the magazine originally, now owned by 19 Group from about 3 or 4 years ago. It's a big decision for them to move from print. David set that magazine up 20 years ago.
I know.
And so
they always say to remain current and remain on topic, though, you have to kill a lot of babies, which sounds a horrible term. But what I mean is things that you are it's a comedic term. They said to be a successful comedian, you've got to kill a lot of babies, because something you think is hilarious, or something you think is really interesting, or something you're so passionate about and you love so much, if it is no longer applicable, if it's no longer relevant, if it's not as useful in its current form, it's got to evolve, or you've got to sacrifice it and then take the 7 pieces from the shattered glass and remake the new thing. Because it's not people saying this isn't interesting, it's saying how I would like to digest it, or how I'd like to accept it or intake it, So that's, I don't know, it sounds like a horrible term, but when people say quick kill a lot of babies, something that you've started, like for David, and go, look, this needs to evolve. Do you remember the Blockbuster to Netflix analogy, when they had the opportunity to buy Netflix in its infancy and they turned it down? I think they turned it down 3 times. And then Blockbuster 3-4 years later was just closed. And now YouTube is the biggest TV channel in the world, isn't it? It's another analogy for it.
So I think it's the same for a publisher like us, that we have to move with the times. It's not the end by any means. It's just the next phase. It's the next stage of our journey of communicating with people across the emergency services. And I'm quite excited about it. I think there's plenty of new ways we can communicate with people using our website in much more imaginative, innovative ways, and definitely getting into that more kind of audio and video space as well. So I think it's a great new thing, great new opportunity for us.
I think you're better positioned than most people in the sector. You've got that respect, you've got that authenticity, you've got that longevity. It's just that humility aspect, which you're demonstrating in a big move like this. But for people to be able to get over themselves and go, you know what? People do want to hear from this. They want to hear from the people in the sector. They want to be informed. They want to be at the tip of the sword of the knowledge and the innovation and blah, 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 blah. But we need to get over ourselves and go, this is going to change. You know what I mean? We need to change. So props, to you guys and girls for making that shift, because it's huge.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Gore-Tex Professional Fabrics. Now, we all know the working environment of a firefighter is filled with challenges. We face serious risks on the job, such as heat exhaustion, burns, physical and mental stress, and we frequently come into contact with high levels of toxic chemicals. Now, I have been wearing Gore-Tex for nearly 2 decades on the front line, working in hostile environments, tackling challenging incidents from firefighting to water incidents and in urban search and rescue environments. Gore-Tex have a well-earned reputation for protecting professionals in the fire and emergency services through their family of highly innovative, waterproof, breathable moisture barriers that exceeds global performance standards and are trusted worldwide. Gore-Tex, going further together.
I suppose there's been a similar shift with the Emergency Services show, because that's kind of, we saw that shift to the 19 Group, and then they kind of expanded and became part of a series of shows. We now have the Innovation and Technology, the Future of Policing. I'm probably getting all this wrong. What's involved in the shows now? Yeah, please do.
So we have the Emergency Services show. And then the innovation for this year was to extract the technology elements from it and put those into their own hall, recognising, again, a bit like the conversation we just had about media, recognising what people are doing, how people are working, and the huge strength of technology to support services. So by having them in a separate hall, all combined, you get the kind of synergy of bringing everybody together, and it allows it to just expand and grow. And it was really, really, really good this year, and it will definitely grow next year. Lots we've learned from it. And just bringing more people together. In terms of policing, so we had a policing theatre in there, but we're still looking at how we organise all of the floor plan. So that's still early days for that. But certainly, Emerging Technology Show is here to stay.
Such a huge beast of a thing to try and wrap your arms around. And most people go, oh, but it's once a year. Oh my God, the clock is ticking even before the show go. The clock for next year is probably ticking before this year finishes. You know what I mean? It's like when you think you've got, well, it's the author's analogy, wasn't it? They say before you finish writing this current book, you should already be thinking about your next one.
Yeah.
On that point of AI, sorry, you we were speaking before we started recording. You recently went to an AI seminar celebration. Word. You know, you went to to remind me because you went with a whole bunch of sector experts. What did you take away from that? Because I find that aspect so fascinating as to how we could integrate and benefit from that across all emergency services.
So the thing that's happened recently is the government's AI Safety Summit. So that was a very much like top level government leaders from around the world coming together to consider what are the safety aspects of AI. What do we need to be thinking about in order to make sure that when we introduce artificial intelligence into our work, into our world, that it's done in a safe, ethical way. And so that's what that summit was about. So I'm really interested in reading about that and have been to various events prior to that. There was one, the AI summit in Queen Elizabeth Conference Centre maybe 3 months ago. And a lot of the time, this is nothing to do with the emergency services. This is all about what everybody else is doing and what we, the emergency services, can learn from them. Where should it be? Where are the touch points? And I think out of all the emergency services, probably police are furthest forward in terms of their
Yes, I would agree with you. Do you think it's because of the terrorism aspect to it? Do you think that's why it's such a necessity? I suppose for us, fire service wise, and even NHS, there are lots of low-hanging fruit for efficiency. It's working smarter, not harder. Whereas for the police, they really need to be the finger on the pulse because of the obvious criminal aspect to the work that they not that they do, but that they work hard against. That's the really scary side because it's a little bit like, you know, we're letting it out of the box, and you can never put that thing back in it.
Yeah, there is that fear, isn't there? That it's something that you can't control. And that's very much what the summit was about last week, was about having that pause and thinking about what does safe AI look like? Because it does have massive potential for efficiencies. Mm-hmm. In terms of terrorism, I don't know enough to comment on that particularly. But in terms of how it can be used in a way that breeds trust and confidence, I think that's the big thing for police, is that if you're going to use artificial intelligence in any way, your dealings with the public and taking the public's data, whether that's faces through facial recognition, whether it's through information they give you through a 999 call, or however else they interact, that when they use the data, the public needs to know that it's confident and can trust you to use your data in a way that is as you would expect and is not biased and is not going to be misused in any way. So I think those are the sort of touch points for policing. I interviewed Peter Doherty, who is the cyber lead for the National Police Security Council a few weeks ago. And he talked very much about trust and confidence and about how, you have to be sure that when you're dealing with people's data and you're dealing with it in a way that you're making decisions, that you do it in a way which is open, transparent and clear to what the purpose is.
Do you think we're forced to move slower in the emergency services because there's always such a colossal level of responsibility involved in what we do? We don't have the benefits of a small, independent, agile, entrepreneurial startup to be able to, move fast and break things. To quote Apple, wasn't it? It's like we have to move cautiously and responsibly with this stuff. But then you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Because people are like, why are you not benefiting from all these? But then as soon as we do something wrong, which happens all the time, just through natural human error, accident, very little of it is ever malicious. But then you hold over the coals and, thrown into the House of Commons or, put on top of the front page or something.
I think there is that caution that comes with public accountability, which is what you're talking about there.
Yeah.
And I think that's right.
Yes.
So we need to be sure that when government or public sector or police or fire or whatever we're talking about, when they're investing public money, that it's done in the right way. And so there's a natural caution in there and a bureaucracy around that in terms of procurement and making sure that this is transparent and fair. So there's that side of it. But I think there is innovation going on. And I think certainly within government, you can see the development of the Accelerated Capability Environment, ACE, which is a small outfit within the Home Office, on the edge of Home Office, where they take small problems faced by the emergency services, police particularly, but could be others, and say we could bring in a small supplier who can come and do something with you to solve this problem, to test it out, but in 8 weeks, in a very, very quick, sprint, agile way to solve a problem. Kind of go, okay, I've got a proof of concept here. I'm quite confident about this. Okay, let's put a bit more money into it. And so there's that element. And also within policing, you have something called the STAR programme. So I can't remember what STAR stands for, but it's essentially a pot of about £3 million that the police, through their science department. So there's Paul Taylor, who's the Chief Scientific Advisor for the National Police Service Council, and he oversees the sort of science and technology part of the NPCC. And they ask police forces to bid into this pot for innovative things to solve problems, and then come out
Give
with
us your wicked problem.
And then test it. And you know what? Sometimes they just fail, and that's fine. But sometimes they don't. And sometimes they could be scaled up to a region, to a national level. And sometimes they can go all the way through it and actually make a fundamental difference. So that work is going on, but it's not necessarily all shouted about very much.
No.
Policing, I think they're probably further forward than perhaps they are in ambulance and fire.
Definitely.
But for sure, there is innovation going on.
I often think of the emergency services family. I think of the NHS as this colossally busy older sister who is just got such an important, massive life with huge influence everywhere. I feel like police, people love them or they hate them. But I sometimes feel like the fire service is the poor, distant cousin because we're obviously significantly smaller than the other two, both in resource and finance and stuff like that. But also from our behavioural points, we seem to be stuck in the past with many aspects of it. You mentioned when we were speaking about AI there, this aspect of trust and confidence. So I think that might be a lovely segue perhaps into some of the cultural stuff when we're speaking about emergency services as a whole, and then perhaps double clicking into things like the fire and rescue service. You, having worked across the emergency services times now for a year or so, you've probably had or been able to benefit from some insights into the ways and lessons learned from other services, because I think we're also guilty of siloed working often in many services, certainly in the fire service. And we struggle to, it appears on the surface and reading reports, we struggle to develop cultures at the pace that society would like us to, and I think would make for the healthiest working environments. What's been your experiences in those conversations across different services?
Okay, so culture is such a big topic. I think it's difficult in some ways to get out of London thinking about this because of the Casey review into the Met Police and because of the report into London Fire Brigade. And so I think it's hard to kind of get beyond those massive metropolitan services and think, what are the things that apply to everybody? So I think it's right that the Inspectorate decided to do its report into fire, to look at the services and to see where they are in terms of how they treat their staff, how their staff feel about the differences in the way people are treated. So
what do you think, provoked that shift? Because historically, it was the HMI only really inspected policing, didn't they? There's been a shift in the past 5 years.
Yeah,
maybe?
I think 2017 the law changed, the Policing Act changed to enable the Inspectorate to be the regulator of fire.
How do you think that lead balloon landed?
I think it was the right thing to do. I think the service had missed the HMI for the years that it was gone. I think that it missed the scrutiny, particularly when you lost the Audit Commission as well. So, fire was just kind of left looking at itself. And, best will in the world. When you mark your own
services
homework,
wandering in different directions.
So I think, that shift from, getting rid of the Inspectorate and then getting rid of the Audit Commission, then you had the whole CPA process and all these processes, and then eventually deciding in 2017 that actually let's just put back an inspector. I think it was the right thing to do.
Definitely.
I know there's not necessarily agreement across the piece about how well it works, depending on who you talk to. But from my perspective, it's good to have scrutiny and to look at it and shine those spotlights. The cultural spotlight was the right thing to do at the right time, for sure.
Do you think it is leading to changes? Because there's been many recommendations. I think in a recent post, you actually credited Merseyside for making some
Yeah, their inspection went
shifts.
really well. They got outstanding on about 3 or 4 different areas, which is unusual. Because I remember when the inspections first happened of 5, Lancashire was the only one to get an outstanding, and it was on values and culture. It was in that key space.
Ah, why do you think that was?
At the time,
Yeah.
I
What do
think,
you think they're doing well that we could learn from?
oh, well, you're asking me something about Lancashire from years ago, which I'm not sure I can
I
remember
know.
the
It might not be
detail
the
of.
case now.
And they've had a change of leadership from there as well. So Justin Johnson's the chief now, whereas that report came just on the cusp of the leadership change. But certainly, I think, when the inspectors go in, they're looking to see what is the story that people are telling us. Is it consistent? And clearly there was a consistent story there about what the values were of that organisation, and they had embedded them through whatever techniques they'd used. So hopefully what's happened is that, and in fact I do know that lots of services went to Lancashire and said, please tell us how you do this. They wanted to learn. And so that's good to hear that. And I suspect that happens in other spaces as well, but maybe in a quiet way. We just want to learn quietly and take that back to the branch and look over time to make those changes.
From the time that you spent in the US, what are there any significant differences you see in culture, pride for first responders from commenting and writing and documenting the work that you were doing over there, visiting different fire services, fire stations, versus, for example, obviously you spent some time alone in fire brigade before that, and a number of years freelancing across the UK.
So the time in America, so I was there for 3 years. And in
Okay.
that time, I spent some time with the fire department in New York. I went to Detroit, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, I think. Yes. So a few, the big services. And the big difference, of course, is that the metropolitan services are funded reasonably well. And then there's a vast number of volunteer fire departments. It's got, the proportions are quite different to how they are here. I suppose one thing I really noticed in the States was on the PPE, their names on the back.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So there's a real
Yeah.
pride in your name and your ladder or whatever your bit of this.
Isn't that nice though? I like
And
that.
it's nice. It is nice, and you do see a lot of boot waving on the side of roads, or people trying to get money. So then the volunteer departments, because they're not funded, so they had to try and raise their money to get the funding. But I mean, the most stark example, I think, in terms of difference between the US and the UK at that time was in Detroit, for sure. Detroit had been through a terrible, terrible time in terms of the city shrinking. So it was huge. You think of Motor City, so there's millions and millions of people. And over time, it has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. And so basically what you got left with these entire neighbourhoods empty. And they're all, basically, the buildings were just being set on fire. So they'd go to a fire and it'd just be this empty building just going up fire, on fire, all over the place. And so they had a real problem with that. And so imagine as a service, if that's where you're going to, it's basically to deal with the fact that these empty buildings, so they're on fire because people they're not being looked after, they're just got spotters in. And then you're driving on streets where there's no street lights because they turn the lights off because no money's paid for
Oh my
lights.
God.
There's potholes in the road, and you're driving fire trucks which are 10 years out of date, have held to go with sticking plaster. So it's a real eye-opener for me to go to a city which was basically bankrupt, and how its public services were able to deal with it, because the base of income for the tax income has shrunk so much they couldn't pay for their basic services. So 10 years on, I'm hoping that has improved. I haven't looked at it recently, but that was a real eye-opener in terms of culture. They really, really, really wanted to do the job, but they just didn't have the money to do it. And I think we've had a little bit of that here in terms of austerity and how that impacts services and how they're able to deliver what they want to deliver, but if the budget isn't there, then they get cuts. You get cuts in the back office, you get cuts in terms of number of firefighters over time. So that makes a difference when there's not enough money to go around.
I think that is very on point for where we are currently, especially given all the very much needed, but I'm sure many who are writing the checks would say inappropriately timed. But again, a pay rise is never appropriately timed if you're the one paying the pay rise. massive, massive, colossal. I think it's like 80 something percent of most services now is spent on personnel,
Yeah,
on
80,
payroll.
that's about right. Yeah.
80%. And when it comes to implementing strategy and policy and how those things interface with the operational world in terms of so many changes ongoing now, so many challenges, EV, with AI, with contamination, with neurodiversity, with all of these things, it must be a tremendously challenging time when a lot of these service leaders are looking at the tools and resource they have available to implement some of the recommendations that are coming out of these reports.
Today's podcast is powered by our partner Lifelines and their revolutionary approach to functional hydration. Just like in firefighting, water is essential for body function, but studies show more than 80% of firefighters are dehydrated. A 25-year study findings from the National Institute of Health showed poor hydration to be linked to early aging and chronic disease, and even mild dehydration results in significant negative impact outcomes including headaches, exhaustion, rapid pulse, irritability, and poor cognitive function. A study conducted by Yale University showed that participants who were just 1% dehydrated had a 12% increase in errors when performing tasks that required cognitive flexibility. In addition, dehydration is shown to worsen mood and attitude, contribute to confusion and poor decision making, and negatively affect memory and judgment. In other words, you really don't want your incident commander, firefighter, or for that matter any first responder on a critical scene to be even slightly dehydrated. Mild dehydration occurs when a person is just 1.5% dehydrated, a condition that does not even trigger the thirst response in most people. So just imagine how quickly a firefighter or any first responder can and does become dehydrated in their day-to-day duties, which is why I address my hydration first thing every day with Lifelines. Go into the notes for this episode and specifically check out Lifelines Hydro Fuel and Hydro OG by clicking in the notes for the podcast for a clean energy solution designed for those who demand more from their day. Now back to the show.
Yes, very much so. And I think, as a leader in any of these services, in any public service, you have to make sure you cover your statutory responsibilities to deliver that to your local community. I mean, you've seen local authorities, Birmingham, Woking, and others who have had to basically say, we haven't got enough money anymore. We can only just about cover our basic services. And so when you're at that point in your budget, you've got to think, I don't think any fire service are in that place, thank goodness. But I think it's to cover the statutory responsibilities and then to give back to the public what they need, but always based on risk.
Yeah.
You have to deliver your IRMP. It's got to be realistic.
Makes me think that things like fire investigation or rope rescue, things like that, things that don't sit within our statutory responsibility, still play a big role in a lot of services today. I am surprised that hasn't started. We haven't started to see those things being cut from a lot of services, even though water issues and rope incidents seem to be on the rise. Certainly, water incidents do across the UK, but those things inherently are not statutory requirements of the fire service.
That's right. So, certainly flooding. Flooding is an interesting one. So there is no statutory responsibility in England for the fire and rescue service to respond to floods. And
spend millions on resource, though.
The Fire Brigade Union has just published its Firefighters Manifesto last week, and there was a big march in London for it. And a restatement of that, their continued policy that they want to see a statutory duty for flooding. I mean, that's been going on for as long as I've been involved with fire. But of course, the problem is once you give a statutory responsibility, you must give funding.
Yeah.
And so
the irony is you get what you tolerate. And I always say this to friends, I say it to my kids, and I'm like, if you're going to keep doing it for free, for all the your services are already delivering this in most parts of the UK without it being instructed, then why would I make it that and have to give you more money? The unfortunate, and I'm not suggesting this is what we should do, but people services need to put a stake in the ground and say, we're not doing it anymore. Can't afford it. But that's such a bold call. And someone ultimately there's always the problem with ours is you can't just pack up shop and say, you know what, end of business. We're gonna go and do something else. We're gonna knock this on the head. And ultimately, when we are unable to do things or unable to deliver parts of our services and roles that traditionally we've been able to, the people that often pay the cost of the society and the community. Yeah. And that's the same for police and NHS, really, which makes it a really difficult sector to work in, I think.
Yes, you're right. I think if you stop doing the things that people are used to seeing and you don't have a good reason and a good story behind it all to keep your public interested and you're public on your side, then it's a very difficult dilemma for any leader and any certainly on the union side as well. I don't say this is an easy problem to solve, but simply to point out that it has been resurrected through the Firefighters Manifesto. It's interesting to say that.
How have you found the shift from freelance into doing what you're doing now, into editing? You know, sort of stepping, I don't want to say stepping up, but stepping into a role like this, where you're supporting editing, you know, being the architect of something so big. And I'm not pretending you do it all by yourself by any stretch of the imagination, but the Emergency Services Times, it's astounding how packed full of information the website and the magazines are. How have you found that shift?
I've really enjoyed it, actually. It's been really interesting going from a time when I worked with Andrew Lynch at Fire Magazine, where he and I would have a chat. And I go, oh, well, I'm going to go to this thing and I'm going to write about this stuff. And here it is. And just deliver to a deadline. And then magically it appears in the magazine. So that was lovely. But now what I have is the beauty of these, we'll talk about the print issue because that's what we're still doing, of being able to say, okay, so I've got this issue. I've got a forward look which says, I'm going to have, so for instance, December, it's resilience and health. So two big topics. And I'm going to dig around and I'm going to find people who are doing interesting stuff in those areas. And then I approach them and I say, would you like to write for us? I've got this topic, looks really good. Or can you repurpose something that you've done over here? And you just sort of throw loads of ideas out. And then, 70% of them come back as copy, which you can then edit.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, it's not a bad return, Matt, actually. I mean, you have to remember
it's a bloody good return.
For most people, they enjoy the process of being published. So for them, that's quite a nice, it's the kind of thing, you send to your mum. Okay, go, look, Mum.
Yeah, it's like a knowledge flex a little bit, isn't it? And not like you're boasting, but it's a strange thing we have. And I've heard this with guests and stuff before. People are like, oh, I don't really think I'm that interested. I'm not really that knowledgeable. I said, yeah, you don't think you are, because you've been there for the last 20, 30 years, learning it all. It's so everyday to you. But all of that knowledge that sits within your head is fascinating. It's so incredibly valuable to other people. And I think we should encourage so much more of that. People to write and be creative and to learn how to articulate their thoughts and knowledge and experiences.
Yes, that's right. And it is an opportunity for people, particularly there's in the magazine at the moment, although it won't be in the new, when we move to digital, is the last words feature on the back of the magazine, where I find somebody who's not well known, who's not doing what we consider to be the traditional parts of the services, and give them 750 words to write about them, why what they're doing is interesting. And these little stories are mostly from young people, mostly people at the beginnings of their careers, who can write in quite an authentic, kind of passionate way, which is very different to the style of the rest of the magazine. And that's been lovely, really nice having that, to give people that little space to do it. And also changing the people section, where before it would always be, Chief so-and-so has moved from here to there. Yeah. And Chief so-and-so has moved from here to there. And it was always a bunch of white blokes. So now I've changed all of that because I've got feedback from our readers that basically said, I don't want to read all of that. Some of it's interesting, but please stop telling us that. So I've switched it around, and now I dig around and find the interesting people who've won an award or who've done something brave or who have written something interesting or whatever, and put them together on a page. You kind of go, here are the people of the emergency services doing interesting things. So that's been quite a nice step forward to do as well. So to being the editor allows you to do that, to make those little changes.
Have you at all felt like you've had to sacrifice a slight bit of your own I mean, you have to be creative in doing that element of it as well, but going from being the deliverer, being able to get right down into the weeds of something yourself, do you ever feel that pang of, not jealousy of the writer, but that like, oh God, yeah, but that'd be interesting to get into.
I still do some of that. I mean, I do a lot of interviews. So I interview quite a lot of service leaders, chief fire officers, police, HMI, various people across the services. So that's where I really get that ability to dig into it. It's still 1,000 words, but it allows you to keep on top of things and to get in touch with someone saying, what you're doing is really interesting. I'd like to speak to you about it. And they get, okay. And that's really good.
When you said there about 1,000 words or 750 words, and this will actually be something that's really useful for a lot of people going through promotion processes and applications, or writing applying for a grant or anything like that. What advice would you have for people on writing? What advice would you have for people on, I struggle with brevity, terribly. Hence why the
Your
podcast probably suits
podcast
me,
is so long.
because I can waffle. It's terrible, Jesus. But it's like, you try and look at the transcript for this stuff. It's like, for God's sake, get to the point.
Mm.
But how did you find that? How have you coached and helped people that are moving into this world, even people writing reports, people writing articles and services? Because obviously you came from, or one of your roles was LFB and community safety and writing things that are interesting and punchy. And how do you develop that muscle? Because it's different to how people usually communicate in the world, isn't it?
Yes, very much so. So I think a lot of writing, it's like any skill, you have to keep doing it. And so if you don't
Okay.
practice, you don't get better at it. So what I always have to remember is the people who are writing are not people who are doing it for their job. It's not their day-to-day thing. So for me, it's more about tell me the story, give me the narrative, give me a beginning, a middle, and an end, and write short, sharp sentences which are punchy and interesting. And if you can do that in 1,000 words, that's great. And then I'll take care of the rest. So it's really about just giving people the confidence to have that story and to tell it. Some people are great at it and some people less so. And that's absolutely fine. And that's the nature of commissioning content, where you're not paying professional journalists. You're asking people to talk about their work and share it with other people. So yeah,
It's got to be a lot harder though, rather than a professional that will bang it down, signed, sealed, delivered, like in a large-scale newspaper who are only got
yeah.
going through
We're
their own
not in that
challenges.
world, unfortunately.
No, God, yeah, because some people are just starving for context, aren't they? I'm terrible for that. I'm like, when I go for interview processes for jobs and stuff, I want to give context on stuff. No, Pete, I need you to stick to the example. Just let's move on. And I'm like,
Yeah,
I'm
you don't want to
terrible.
be too formulaic in the sense that you don't want to lose the sense of the authenticity of the experience of the person writing. That's always nice to feel their style coming through. So it's not sort of really getting rid of everything and taking all the
Yeah.
style out. You want to keep that, but the message has to come through, the story has to come through, and that's what you're sort of wrestling with.
You've done a lot of writing in the past around the role of women in the fire service. That sort of lack of diversity that we see across
Yeah.
different services. This is something that came up in just in the process of editing an episode with Miriam Heppel,
Yeah.
a very interesting lady, and she spoke very passionately around diversity and how we look at it only through one lens. What have your learnings been from both your working with women in the fire service and women in services, and diversity as a whole? Because for a lot of people, it is sometimes just a punchline. It's something they write on a wall. You need to make sure it says it on the document. What does it mean to you, and what do you think it means to people in the services and the different, I suppose, the ways they interpret it?
Yeah, so I think there's a few bits to that. The first is my own lived experience in terms of whenever I go anywhere,
Yeah.
any service thing, I can guarantee there will be no queue for the ladies. So that's how few women are in the world that I work in. So
Yeah.
that's not a bad thing from that point of view. But and I still, after all these years, I'm still kind of like, I come home and go, oh, there are no women.
Yeah.
And I could count them. I could see them around the room going, there's 6 in this, there's 100 men.
Yeah.
And so there's that kind of a feeling about it.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you ask me why that matters, it matters because you need diverse voices, you need diverse thinking to come up with good solutions. If everybody's got the same lived experience, if everybody is the same and has that same thought process, then you're always going to get the same answer. But actually what you need is some diversity of thought. And that's not necessarily about being a woman, but it's about your lived experience, where you've come from, your background, your ethnicity. There's a whole range of things. If you bring all of that, then you're going to get a much richer solution to whatever you're trying to achieve. So I think that for me is fundamentally what's beneath all of that. I sort of keep a regular count on how many chief fire officers are women, for example. It
Okay.
ebbs and flows, and I think it's about 6 at the moment out of
That's dropped a little bit, hasn't it?
50 odd. So it's just, I think at one point it peaked at 8, possibly 9.
Yeah.
And so I find it deeply depressing. But then I think about what's coming through services in terms of the number of women coming through a sort of a group manager, area manager, up through those senior roles. And there are women coming through, but because there's so few of them coming at the bottom of the pipeline, as it were, it'll take generations for it to be normal, for there to be plenty of women coming through and plenty of competition to get to the roles at the higher levels.
So it's great in the last 30 years we've seen a swing in empowering women in the workplace and unlocking doors to certain opportunities and things like that. But I've read a number of things that almost seem to vilify the individual who wants to be a family person, even if it's just a stay-at-home mom or a stay-at-home dad. And this whole girl boss analogy seems to have made that look as though they're failing as a person, like they have an obligation. Like if you're a woman in fire service now, or even a woman in police or anywhere really. In fact, not the same in the NHS. And we'll talk about that in a second. But certainly in fire and police, it's like you have an obligation to go for it. You should be pushing for we say top, like as though, I know it's a Christmas tree pyramid hierarchical style structure that we have in our services, but for some people that's not a desire. Men and women, it's not a desire. Many men want to be career firefighters. Do you think there's been any kind of pressure put on women that it has to be, you should be developing, you need to be promoted? I think it's so important that support is available to them, but I worry that we might over-index on it.
Possibly. I think what we need is a working environment where people can get to where they want to be with the support in place and to get rid of the barriers. So if the barriers are you need support with childcare, or if you need some time out in order to be with your children when they're very, very young and then come back into the workplace and not be penalised for that, then that should be there. Then, roles that allow people to work flexibly, roles that allow people to be able to perhaps on a Friday go and have their half day with their child because they want to go to assembly, whether you're a man or a woman, these equally apply. So I think there's something about being flexible employers to give people the best grounds on which to say, yes, I'm confident now that I'd like to try for a promotion, or actually, no, I don't. I've had all of these opportunities and actually, no, I'm comfortable at this level. So I think it's about choice and getting rid of the barriers and making the workplace work for everybody. Not necessarily pushing people, but saying, we'll give you the opportunities and we'll help you because everybody should have the chance to go forward, regardless of whether they've had children, haven't had children, what age they are.
Square this circle for me. So if we overlay the experience of COVID on top of this, where we got a lot better at working from home, at flexible working. I used to work for an organisation that did ROWE, which was results-only work environment, where you just had a workload, you had to get it done wherever you choose, and you could work from home a lot, you could work from different sites, different factories, and this can be applied to services, police services, fire services, different stations, different wherever, as long as you get your thing done. But if you want to take few hours off in the afternoon to go and do whatever, just as long as you get the thing done. I think COVID was a massive shift because I think that complements this analogy of flexible working. COVID was a huge shift for people and organizations, and many haven't returned back to you must sit in front of your desk 9 till 5 just because that's the arbitrary way we've always done it.
Yes.
Recognizing that may not be the best way to get the best out of the people in our services. It's not necessarily good for their mental and physical health, doesn't work for their work-life balance, their family. What do you think we learned from something like COVID? Do you think it helped? I think it brought us forward in many ways, but as obviously you wrote a great deal about it, or you and the team did during that time. What was that like as a memorable shift and change, I suppose?
I think you kind of touched on a lot of the answers to that in terms of that flexibility. I think technology has been a huge enabler for people to be more flexible. Think of the way we're talking to each other now. Think of the way people use Teams. Microsoft putting Teams into every police force through COVID. It was a decision made through the police digital service. And it's been a massive shift for people to be able to. I think presenteeism has gone, and that sense of you must be on that bum on seat to say demonstrated you have been there 9 to 5, and I think that's great. And a lot of that is about trust. COVID has sort of shifted the nature of the relationship between the manager and the worker, in inverted commas, to allow people to be trusted to do the job.
Isn't there a cultural cost to that as well, though? Because sometimes, quite often, when we are pack animals, we like to be together.
Yeah,
we like
absolutely.
to. So that's striking that balance. If you were to design a work system, if you had a big, the ST's is probably different because a lot of you probably do work remotely, and that trust is probably a very empowering one. Obviously, on stations, a lot of first responders, again, fire, police, NHS, they have to be there.
Yes.
They have to actually do the thing. And that does make up a large percentage of that organisation, but it doesn't mean we have to sheep dip everyone and tar them all with that same dictatorial brush that's the way we have to work.
Yeah, very much so. And I think you're right. The fire station is the place of work. What I noticed
do that from home.
when I did a piece of work for the National Fire Chiefs Council before I came to the Emergency Services Times, and we looked at how the training regime had changed in terms of, instead of having to go into, particularly if you were on call, if you were having to, you didn't have to go into the station to do your training routines. You could do it at home, you could do it in other places, didn't have to do it together. So we're able to sort of be a bit flexible to keep the training, to keep people's skills up, while still keeping the COVID regime, sticking to that as well. So there was some flexibility and changes, and whether those sort of things have continued, I don't know. But in terms of the pack animal thing, you're absolutely right. I think people do need to be together. I work at home 3 days a week, and I go into the office 2 days a week, and the stimulation you get from working with others, it's really, really empowering. It can, it's good to be able to kind of go, well, I can do my work, which is good in a noisy environment here, but actually if I want to be quiet.
You do feel less efficient. I do. I can get twice as much done at home than I can do when I'm in the office.
Yeah, but I bet you hanker after that human contact after a little while.
You do. Of course I do. I love it. That's why I end up spending hours of my day talking to people anyway, because I just that we like viscerally, we need that. We need that oxytocin, that that there's endorphins, that dopamine, that exchange, don't we?
And that works equally as well in terms of the emergency services show. So the environment, that sense of bringing people together, it's very much the ethos. So the chief executive of 19 Group is called Peter Jones, and he talks a lot about bringing people together, bringing those ideas, and where people meet, that's where you get that stimulation, that innovation, the thinking and the chatting and the networking and the learning. You do that when people would come together, and so that's why the shows still exist, and they've survived COVID. So you've got into that show environment, and you see thousands of people now still coming together because people thrive in it.
That was a narrow gap to fit through. To survive through that was incredible, because the events world suffered tremendously. Events, restaurants, entertainment really took a huge brunt of the punch of COVID, and so many of them will never be seen again, unfortunately. So it's a real privilege and great pleasure of mine to be able to continue to attend it each year. I find it fascinating. When we're looking at notable shifts, we've done a couple of episodes recently around wildfires, around climate. Again, this is something that you've probably done a tremendous amount more reading than myself on. Talk to me about some of the impacts that you've seen, heard, and spoke to individuals about when it comes to that aspect and its influence on the emergency services.
Yeah, so I think probably best demonstrated through a visit I did recently. I went to Horsham Fire Station in West Sussex, where they've just opened their first fire station in 50 years, I think it was, on a brownfield site next to a housing development. And they had employed all of these sort of sustainable principles in the building. It's in the building of so it's a training centre and a fire station all in one place. And so, for example, from the simple things to having electric charging points outside, to using solar panels.
That's one of my big frustrations. I've got 2 electric vehicles, and for the life of me, I can't seem to get you just got to have an appetite for it, haven't you? Because all the infrastructure is already there. The larger, wider sector has done a lot of this legwork for us. We just need to find a way to implement these types of things, because it could just be a credit card system. You could just take it off my payslip. I'm not saying these things are easy, but all the tools are there.
Yeah.
And it'd be a great box tick. When you talk about that, box ticking is not what it's all about, I know, but for you to be able to say, we support all of our workers with the ability for them to charge their EV vehicles. And so
that's easy. When you're building something new, you can build that in at the beginning. So you can think about all the green things I've just mentioned, and there are many, many more. But I also just wanted to say at Horsham that they've thought through the use of the decom principles in terms of how they manage contaminants through the building to keep people safe. So they've integrated sustainability and looking after the workforce in terms of contaminants in the same building in this brand new design. So it's interesting to see that happen. It's unusual. There's not many new fire stations that are being built, But it was a good example. But on that point about electric charging, that's really interesting. So lots of estates now, fire police and ambulance estates, are looking to see how are they going to be able to charge these vehicles when more and more of their vehicles are becoming electric or hybrids and sometimes for pure electric.
Very old buildings with not
Exactly.
great wiring in them.
So what they're
Very
looking at, so potentially is what you get a lot of the time is an overlap of police, fire and ambulance estates. So you'll have in an area, all three of them near each other, but do all three of them need to have this investment? So it's like taking these kind of collaborative approaches to charging so that you make the best of the estates and get involved with the local authorities. So it's not just a pure fire, police or ambulance problem. These are cross problems that need to be to have these sort of joined up solutions, and starting to see some of that coming through now.
Yeah. When you spoke there around contamination and some services leading with action, not that others don't have an appetite to, but there is a growing swell. The work done by the Fire Brigade Union. We actually had David Matthews on recently. His episode goes out in a number of weeks. Obviously, speaks very passionately about
he was at the show
contamination. He was as well.
Yeah.
Contamination, PFAS, long-term effects. We had John Lord and a couple of others on.
Yeah.
How were you seeing the shift from the murmurings and the ad hoc evidence now growing into a tidal wave of something must be done? You must show that you have a solution to this, because there's a big culture of court cases, litigation, people suing people in America. This stuff is heading down the pipe towards chief fire officers, but also chiefs of police and NHS and heart teams and paramedics, all of these people that are exposed to this sort of stuff. What are you seeing in the way of conversation around contamination now?
Yeah, so it's interesting you mentioned John Lord. So John, I went to a seminar that he ran last year at Cranfield University where he talked all about the contaminants.
He's doing another one in March, isn't he, next year?
He is, yes. So he's very much on the non-local authority fire service side, so the people working in defence, in
aviation,
other environments, yes, aviation and so forth. So he's very keen about getting the messages out beyond the local authorities. And then you have the decon campaign with the FBU and the work of Professor Anna Steck. So you've got these people working to change the culture, to change the mindset, but not just at a leadership level, but at an operational level, so that behaviour, a lot of this is about behaviour change. So changing the way you think about your uniform, thinking about how your PPE is contaminated, and then how that drags through the environment. So the Horsham fire station takes that, kind of says basically you can't take it beyond a certain room. You've got to take it off. You've got to have a shower. You've got to move. So you go red, green, red or amber green to get to the clean world. So I think it feels to me that this is a language that's just developing and a behaviour that's developing with leadership. All of those things coming together, you're going to get massive improvement. And that's how you get change.
Do you think it's going... I think financial is going to be one of the big barriers for some of the equipment and building shifts, because you're absolutely right. There is a large percentage of this can be picked up from the behavioural shift. But what we tend to see, I mean, a lot of that echoes the work of the union. A lot of that is focused on behavioural at the minute. The work, for example, David Matthews and others are speaking about is around PPE, around fire engine. I mean, I was speaking to a few stations in Scotland recently. Some of them have even got running water. Do you know what I mean? So when we're talking about these glorious new fire stations and, we're going to shower in the hour and we're going to have a decon area at one end of the base and then a different area, and it's going to decon the whole fire engine. They haven't got flipping running water in some of their stations. And I wonder how applicable this is going to be. I wonder the cost of it. I wonder the PPE challenges. There's so many sides to this cube of decontamination. Because if people did take ownership themselves and say, well, I'm simply not going to wear that thing again, or I'm going to wave this report in my line manager's face and say, no, I need 4 sets of fire kit, or I refuse to wear that thing because this evidence shows that even though you've had it washed 3 times, you've only removed 17% of the contaminants. I feel like we've got to pick up the pace of this, but again, we're so limited by financial sometimes.
Yeah, but a lot of that's about leadership. So if the leaders are the ones that can make the change, and it's because they are the ones who are going to talk to their fire authority, and they're the ones going to put it into their budget, they're going to put it into their risk management plans, and to create the environment in which the change can happen. But it also comes from beneath, in terms of the front line saying all the things you've just said, and actually pushing for that change. And that's what the FBU does. That's where its membership and is able to keep the message, keep going. The other thing about change is it takes time, and and often it's not even. So you'll have some services which will be real forward thinking, and others that will come behind, and eventually they'll all get there. But the pace of change is never going to be even, I'm afraid.
Yeah, when we see certain services leading theoretically from the front, it can appear to others quite elitist because of the finances and things like that. Speaking about large services and cultural shifts, we had Peter Apps on recently. He had a very insightful, provocative to some, very interesting book about Grenfell.
Yes.
We are seeing the latter phases of the reports coming out now. How have you seen that unfold? Because you've done a heck of a lot of work on it, as of the rest of the team, trying to document and inform the stages and trying to unpick the information. Because, in all honesty, some of the initial reports that came out weren't very digestible. They're very heavy. And the problem with the first element of the report being focused on the operational response kind of set a tone for the rest of the inquiry, in that it positioned the failure of the emergency services at the front and centre. And I feel, probably biasedly, that we never really managed to move past that in terms of how the news was displayed. Whereas Peter Apps's book obviously points a lot at the responsibility of the organisations that allowed these failings to perpetuate for so long. What's your feelings about it now? I'm not really looking back on it because it's not yet finished, but it's quite some time that's passed.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's 2017, so it was 6.5 years in.
Crazy.
And it is one of those moments where I think most people would say to you, what were you doing when you saw back?
Yeah.
It's kind of like that moment, and I remember it myself. So, yes, I have written a lot about it. I spent a lot of time at the inquiry in phase 1, not so much in phase 2. And I think what's interesting for me is the media around this, in terms of when I first went to the inquiry, when it first started, you go into the media room and it'd be full of national journalists who knew nothing about fire, absolutely nothing. And they'd be asking, there'd be FBU people there, and they'd be asking them questions about, what does this mean? What does this mean? What does this mean? Sort of a world of acronyms and language and context, which nobody understood, because quite frankly, the only time we saw fire in a newspaper, it was so rare that I'd actually go, oh my God, there's something in the newspaper about fire. And I'd clip it out, or I'd take a picture of it, and I'd send it online. And then suddenly everything was about fire, and everybody was interested in fire. So to that extent, the media has kind of digested and learnt a lot about the fire world through the lens of the inquiry. And so, of course, if you learn through one medium, you take one view. And so I think for many people reading the other end of that, which is the stories, they get that view of fire. And fire is so much richer and has so much of a deeper background that it felt unfair to me that's how people saw fire, was through the lens of Grenfell.
Yeah. So we had the Grenfell, and then obviously we almost fell straight after that into some of the cultural review stuff, and it just felt like kicking someone when they were down, even though a lot of the cultural stuff needed to have its time and needed to be presented and does need to have a great shift. I worry about the morale that is currently present across some eco fire and rescue services. I think we are going through a unique time where we're doing so much recruitment, so the potential to shift that storyline and morale, and the huge changeover in promotions and chief fire officers and so on and so forth. What do you think morale looks like for the coming few years, I suppose?
Yeah. I don't spend a great deal of time on the front line, so it's hard for me to make judgments about that. But the people that I do talk to, either through the magazine or on the edges of events and things, are that the point you make there about young people coming in, I think that is going to make a big difference. When I've spoken to a few, particularly women coming into the service in their 20s, and you talk to them about the service, it's like they don't really recognise what you're talking about. For them, it's this job. They're doing well. They're interested. They're confident, and it feels almost like they don't know or recognise the history or think about culture in the way that perhaps we do, because we're older and we've seen more of it. So I think actually that's quite refreshing that they're so positive and confident about their careers and why they're going to be there. The other thing, of course, is those young people will probably not spend 30 years as a firefighter. And so I think
No,
that really affects
short
morale,
careers now.
because if you have someone coming in for, say, 10 years, then they've brought something with them and they go with their firefighting career somewhere else. And so you don't have that 30-year career stuck in one place, maybe even on one watch for all that time on one fire station. So those cultural issues that we've had as a result of perhaps people being together in one place for too long and creating
Yeah.
cultures which were not acceptable to others, that will start to go. And that feels quite positive to me.
How much as well do you think the shift into things like direct entry? We spoke earlier about diversity of thought as well. I'm really excited about that, and I
Did you
think
talk to
that
Dawn
is.
about that when you had her on? I've not watched that. I've not listened to that one.
Yeah. Dawn obviously was one of the not only just early adopters, but early products of something like direct entry, and she spoke very passionately about it. But I'm really excited to see how this is accepted when this first batch, for want of a better description, I think they started this year, didn't they?
Yes, station
Begin to
manager
go through
level.
their development. We've had a few of them come and speak to the podcast and start listening in and send us messages and a few little weird things like that. There really is such a rich and eclectic background that these people are coming from.
Yes.
How do you think that's going to help us manifest some of these changes that we need to see?
I share your excitement about this. I think direct entry is a great thing to do. I suspect it's not the first time it's been tried, but it's interesting. It's a national scheme with many services. I think maybe I could say about 12. I'm not sure the number's
Yeah.
quite right. Of people who are trying it out and bringing people in. I've said to Dawn, I think, about having a regular feature in EST about, let's hear the story. Let's have the diaries. Let's hear what happens. Because obviously everybody has their ups and downs when they start a new job. There is all that. It's the same issues you start any job. You've got to work out, well, what am I coming into? What do I need to learn? How do I need to adjust what I do? Because I've got my experience, they've got their experience. How do we bring these together to get where we need to be? So, in that sense, I'm very positive about it, but I'm also not naive. I don't think that, not everybody's going to be accepting of the fact that you haven't had 20 years to get to the fire station, be the station manager, and had all those incidents to draw on that experience. So getting that balance
We need to
right.
have strong champions and some strong support mechanisms in
Yes, very
place.
much so.
Otherwise, there will be, and I can see them now already, not that they've happened already, but I can see them end up happening. Some people might get fed to the wolves if we're not very careful.
Yeah, and that's really, again, it goes back to that leadership again. So the people who have brought them in at this level from another organisation have clearly seen skills and aptitude that will make them good station managers. So let's let them grow, give them the circumstances which to do that. And when it doesn't work properly, and things aren't working right, then deal with it to move it on. Because what we don't want is a whole load of failure kind of go, oh, well, that didn't work. Let's not do that again. Let's just be positive.
Yeah, because I think of it like a sports game when I think of things like that. You only need a couple of bad tackles, and the whole war, like a war, but the whole thing can shift, and it just gets bowled over. You just need to recognise a few failures, a few missteps, a few people that weren't supported or managed correctly, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, because I think there's a tremendous amount of positive. And also, when people hear direct entry, they think, oh, what? Sally from Sainsbury's, who's been on the shop floor for 2 weeks, you're going to come and be a stay? No, really, it's a very ridiculous and salacious way to think about it. I really think that people should start learning a little bit more about these individuals, and like if something like the diaries in the Emergency Services Times is one example, because some of them have got some really fascinating careers, from very similar sectors as well. To be honest, I think there's I've seen people from the RF, from the military. Some people from high-level private business who have got some really, really interesting career experiences that would make them real assets to the emergency services.
Yeah, exactly. It goes back to that point you talked about earlier in terms of, why do you need women and a diverse range of people in your service? We need diverse experience, and if you can bring them in at that sort of middle management, or come out to principal officer level, then you can again inject into your organisation a diversity of thought to get better outcomes. We just need to make sure that they're coached, they're mentored, that they have the support mechanisms to allow them to thrive and succeed.
I want to be respectful of your time, but I wanted to ask you about the upcoming election. and the effects that has on
Yeah.
the emergency services. Now, I know all of us were limited by our knowledge and experience in this, but I'm extraordinarily inexperienced in knowing the effects of elections on fire and rescue services. Is something I definitely want to increase my knowledge on. Could you try and give us a few touch points, a few insights into pros and cons, or not even pros and cons perhaps, but simply the effects that the upcoming election might have on the capabilities of the emergency services?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing to point out, which is not exactly but related to that, is around the fire reform white paper. So,
Yes.
in order to make the changes that you want to see at legislative level, you go through a sort of white paper process. And so that is now 15, 16 months late of having a government response, right? So they sent a paper out, said, we'd like to do some more reform to fire and rescue service, one of which was change of governance. So thinking about, could we do more on police, fire and crime commissioners, for example? And 18 months or however long it is, July was the anniversary, so wherever we are now, so it's 11 months. So that means now that we don't know whether the government is going to do anything with that because they haven't given a response. So we don't know if it'll ever change. And now that we've had the King's speech,
How does that happen? Does it must feel
because
like these senior leaders are just screaming into the void?
because there'll be discussions going on in government, with the civil service and with the ministers about what the answer should be, and nobody can agree on it, I expect. That's probably why it's never appeared. So we sort of sit there waiting for it to appear. It hasn't appeared, and the King's speech has happened, which has set out a legislative programme, which takes us pretty much to the end of this Parliament, which means there'll be no change to fire between now and the next government coming in. So that's my view on that. In terms of government, what we want to see in the manifestos for the parties is something about changing fire that will improve things. But whether that is what the fire service wants is another matter. It's what the parties want. So there's all that influence and lobbying going on in the background to make sure that in those manifestos are the things that people want to see so that they can then be delivered in the first Parliament of a new government. So it's all of that going on in the background. That's where the APPGs come in. So the all-party parliamentary groups, they're kind of able to lobby and talk to ministers in a different way, bring MPs and Lords together to discuss matters. So the group that the late David Amos brought together on fire safety, for example, will be doing things in the background. So all these things are all going on. All of the fire authorities, and we've got these the politicians, the local politicians, who will be also seeking to influence their MPs. So there's all of that going on, as quietly in the background, as you and I are talking, hoping that when you get to the next election, when the new government comes in, the things they want to change because they've already tried to influence it along the way.
What do you think are within our sphere of control? So we look at things like that. When I speak to a few different chief fire officers, and you speak to far more than I do, there are tremendous concerns and challenges with resiliency, with forecasting for the future. They say they're doing it on a year-by-year basis now, which for an ever-evolving service is so difficult and also quite disengaging and confusing for its staff. From what you've learned speaking to all these individuals, what do you think are the things within our sphere of control that we should be focusing on that perhaps would empower leaders to be able to put themselves in the best position for both themselves and their employees, their individuals and their services, to sort of set them up for success in the coming years?
So I think certainly what you're alluding to there is 3-year funding settlements. So really what you ideally want is for the government to give you a 3-year funding settlement that says, here's your money for the next 3 years. And then the politicians, the fire authorities and PFCCs who own the budget will go, okay, this would deliver against this plan, which is done by the chief, put those two things together to deliver over 3 years to meet the needs and risks in that community. That would be your ideal. When you go to less than 3-year settlements, it makes it very hard to plan, very hard to deliver. And so that, I think, would be, I would certainly say that was an ideal way to work, but unfortunately it doesn't always work that way.
So before we close, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, we sort of alluded to it earlier, about where the EST, where the Emergency Service Times is moving. We said about moving to a solely digital world in 2024. Help people, because that's very much tomorrow for all intents and purposes. What will that look like? What are the sort of strategies and objectives? What is that going to look like for the long-term readership, the long-term followership of it?
Okay. So in terms of 2024, we are launching a new website. So that gives us a new platform on which to work, allows us to describe the world of the emergency services in a way that reflects where we are today. So it will be sustainability, technology, people and skills. So these are areas where perhaps before we've put material in there, but be much more focused on the things where we think are of most interest to our readers. So it allows us
Yeah.
to structure our offer more. In order to do that, we want to make sure that we communicate well with our users, so our readers. So that'll be through more regular newsletters, more specialist newsletters, through a series of webinars. So we're running a series of 3 at the end of this month into December, which are kind of an experiment for us. It's the first time we've done them. So I'm hopeful that
That'll be great.
will be lovely. So we'll do those. So we have one on drones, on resilience, and on EVs. So drones and EVs in particular, big topics. Resilience, very much about how organisations manage and plan for when the worst happens. So the reason we've done those was around continuing the conversation from the show. So one of the great things about digital, of course, is it allows us to communicate with our readers all year round. And so by having these webinars, we're able to say, well, pretty much all the people on the webinars are people who were in our show at one of the theatres. So we brought them together to kind of like say, okay, how did that go? How was that webinar? How was that session for you? And continue that conversation. And then we can add perhaps features and things. So kind of building things more rather than being ad hoc. So that's one of the beauties of moving digital.
So there can be like a continuing evolving theme to these things rather than like sporadic bullet holes into subjects over the course.
That's right.
People could go into these areas and see how things have evolved and developed.
That's right. So building things, so able then through the 12 months of 2024, being able to have a forward look. So each month we'll still have features, which will be in our media pack, which is almost ready. So all of that allows us to communicate in a much more structured way, do the video, audio things, which I mentioned earlier, and play with this new world of communicating with people through different channels. So it's an exciting step forward, and I'm looking forward to 2024. It's going to be a very different way of working, but I think hopefully we'll bring our readers with us, and get more and more people writing for us as well. Always one of the reasons for coming on here is to say to people, please do consider writing for us. Tell us what you say.
What is the best way for people? So 2 threads there. What's the best way for people to stay up to date with these evolving changes? And if there are people, because there will be many subject matter experts who want to get their work out there, they want to be able to share their knowledge, their studies. How's the best way for people to get on board, to communicate, to sort of interact with you, I suppose?
So in terms of wanting to write for us, would be to contact me directly or through the website, where the contact details are on our website, emergencyservicestimes.com. So always interested to chat with people about ideas for content. Definitely, that's really useful for us. And then when the website's launched, we'll give the opportunity for people to get informed by signing up for our newsletters, so they can find out what we're doing more often. So that's probably the best way to do it.
Beautiful. So just for people's understanding who are listening to the end now, if you go in the notes for this podcast just below, you'll see a link to the website. That's the contact me area. You can also sign up for the EST newsletter. We'll put that as a separate link. And also, would it be appropriate to put your LinkedIn link in there as well, Catherine? Would that be appropriate?
Yeah, that's fine.
Beautiful. So that's the best way people can find you. Catherine, thanks so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it. I think it would be surprising for people to be seeing us interacting, but I've long said, and we said it actually when we came on today, my level of preparedness is nowhere near. I don't see what we do as in any way direct competition. I'm messing about in the mud, fumbling around with trying to make sense of all of this confusing information. And I do often take so many suggestions and guests and whatnot from the emergency services time. So I would strongly encourage people to go over and take a look.
That's great. Thank you, Pete. I mean, we have to remember, of course, that in order to be an interviewer, which is what you've done very well today, is you give people the space to tell their story. And that's the important thing about this. It's about allowing people to bring that experience. You don't need to know all the things they know. That's why you've asked us to come.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Excellent. Thank you, Pete.
The Firefighters Podcast was created to recognize, acknowledge, inspire, and hopefully even motivate these incredible individuals who have chosen to be part of the first responder community. Our driving purpose is to create a legacy resource for the current and future generations of firefighters and first responders. We get some incredible feedback from listeners and guests. And as the podcast grows, our desire to create longevity and sustainability means we are asking for the support of our listeners. If you want to support the podcast, if you want to get discounts to our merchandise, hoodies, clothing, coins, patches, tallies, and also access to all of the incredible documents get shared with us from our podcast guests and sector leaders, then please head over to our Patreon page, and for just £3 a month, you can support the future of the podcast. Please finally hit that follow, subscribe, or rate button on the platform you're listening, and wherever you're around the world, please support your emergency services responders, and thank you for listening.